In this talk, I'm going to give a brief overview of some work that we completed a bit over half a year ago. In this paper, we looked at the quantized anomalous Hall state in twisted bilayer graphene, and we studied the domain walls that can separate different symmetry broken sectors. So I'm going to start with some background. So it's quite well known by now that if you take two layers of graphene and you rotate them with a relative twist of around 1 degree, you find that the moiré bands become remarkably flat. Not only that, you actually get 8 bands in total. There's a factor of 2 because of the microscopic graphene value, K and K prime. There's a factor of 2 coming from the spin degeneracy, and these bands are actually connected by Dirac points, so there's another factor of 2. You can think of it as coming from the layer degree of freedom. And these flat bands, around 20 MeV in width, they're the origin of a lot of very interesting physics in TBG. For example, correlated insulators, potential unconventional superconductivity, and much more. But here I'll be focusing on one particular facet, which is topological, i.e. the quantized anomalous Hall effect. And the context behind this is that some samples are believed to be aligned with the underlying substrate. And basically you have the graphene layers, and when that aligns with the hexagonal boron nitride substrate, what can happen is that the alignment induces a sublattice splitting, delta. So this is A versus B sublattice energy. And this gaps the Dirac points and leads to very flat Chern bands. So you can see Chern number 1 is blue, Chern number 1 is red, and there's certain time reversal constraints here. Now, when you add interactions, well, we have flat Chern bands. You might expect physics similar to quantum Hall ferromagnetism. And indeed, if you work at a filling of 3 electrons per moiré cell, you might expect to flavor polarize. And so here I have a situation where I filled up all the bands except for one K prime band. And so the system has a net Chern number of 1 or minus 1. And so therefore is expected to exhibit the quantized anomalous Hall effect. And indeed, in 2 experiments in 2019, they actually managed to, at this filling, measure the anomalous and the quantized anomalous Hall effect. So we were thinking about, Cisco was thinking about whether, in a finite sample, you're going to expect to get regions where maybe you've broken the symmetry in different ways. So for example, in one region, I could have exactly this configuration, but in a different region, maybe you've instead emptied out this K band. And so in the middle, where these 2 regions meet, you might expect some domain walls to form. And indeed, more recently, there's been experiments that have imaged in real space the presence of these domains. Now, the physics driving these domain formation is still unknown. One possibility is twist angle domains, but here we're going to analyze the possibility of substrate alignment domains. So what do I mean by substrate alignment domains? Well, this sublattice splitting delta actually has a sign, right? Depending on whether it's A or the B sublattice that's favored. And depending on the sign, the crucial point is that the Chern number assignment is dependent precisely on the sign of delta. So as you can see, in these 2 cases, the Chern numbers are assigned oppositely. And the key point is that, therefore, if you're in a region with a fixed sign of delta, the system can choose between 2 different ground states. So let's say we know our spin here. So you could either decide to polarize in value K or in K prime, and the Chern number is tied to that choice of value by this Chern value locking. And so then if I have a different region with a different sign of delta, it will polarize in one of these 2 ground states. And in the middle where they meet, because the Chern number or the value number both change, you're going to have a domain wall between them. So here, I'm going to categorize the different types of domain walls. So in the first simpler situation, I'm going to focus on a region where the sign of delta is actually constant. So maybe the substrate alignment is pretty homogeneous here. So obviously, you might expect there to be just a uniform bulk. So the clearest case is that where the system decides to uniformly polarize into one of these ground states, and so you just get a single domain with a edge mode around the edge here. But because of thermal fluctuations, you might imagine that you can have situations where you actually have two different parts of this region polarized into different ground states, and this is what we call the intertwined wall. It's the intertwined wall because the value number changes, we're changing the local ground state, but because of this Chern value locking, the Chern number also has to change. Now, the more interesting scenario is where the sign of delta actually flips between these two regions. This is more interesting because you're forced to have a domain wall at the intersection here. So in one case, which we call the value wall, the value number changes, but the Chern number doesn't because the sign has changed on the right-hand side here. The second alternative is the Chern wall, where the value stays the same, but now the Chern number changes. And the key point is that depending on what kinds of walls you get in your system, you can get very different experimental signatures. For example, you might get different transfer properties, and you might even be able to measure, locally different regions of different magnetization. So the most stark difference between these walls is whether you have co-propagating or counter-propagating modes. So in the case of the intertwined wall and the Chern wall, the Chern numbers flip as you go across the domain wall. So therefore you get co-propagating chiral modes at the edge, at the domain wall here. And because they're chiral and they're co-propagating, there's no perturbation that can actually couple these two and gap them out. So therefore, if you have a sample where these kinds of walls percolate, they will short circuit the sample and destroy the quantized anomalous Hall effect. On the other hand, if you have valley walls, well, because the Chern number is constant, then you actually get counter-propagating edge modes. And so if you were to consider perturbations that can mix the values, then you can actually get them to backscatter and gap. So valley walls are not necessarily so deleterious to the quantized anomalous Hall effect. So we're going to be focusing on this situation in this talk because this is where you're forced to have domain walls. And so a very important question is whether you're dominated by valley walls or Chern walls. And so here I'm going to investigate this Chern versus valley wall competition. And the way we did this was that we actually ran Hartree-Fock simulations in the presence of a spatially varying substrate, as you can see here. And this required us to develop a novel technique, which we call the fixed Hilbert subspace. And basically, this is a technique that allows us to deal with any sort of inhomogeneous perturbation in Hartree-Fock. And so we can therefore compute some phase diagram like this. So here we have a phase diagram in twist angle versus substrate gradient space. So as you go down this axis, the substrate changes sign more slowly. And you see that actually you get quite close competition between these two types of domain walls, between this chiral Chern wall and this achiral valley wall. And one important trend is that as you go down this axis, as you make the substrate smoother, you actually favor the valley walls. And this is quite easy to understand. The valley wall, involves change of valley, so it's going to be dominated by valley exchange physics. And so if the substrate is varying quite smoothly, the valley wall would prefer to texture. So it would change valley over a longer length scale in order to reduce the exchange penalty. On the other hand, you can show that the chiral wall, because it involves a flip of a Chern number, and you can't change the Chern number smoothly, it can't actually texture. So it's actually, if you can actually look at the numerics, and you see that the Chern wall is very sharp, no matter whether you have a smooth substrate or a sharp substrate. Well, the valley wall does indeed texture quite wide. And so the Chern wall is unable to really respond to substrate gradients, and therefore it will lose out when your substrate becomes smoother. And indeed, you can write down a very simple signal model or a free energy to sort of model this substrate gradient, domain wall dependence. And indeed, you can see that the domain wall width is quite consistent with the expectation from the symbol free energy. So with that, I'd like to conclude, and thank you for your attention.